Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Radical Polymers. Nation, running a water treatment business is hard. Dealing with your suppliers shouldn't be. And when I deal with the fine folks over at Radical Polymers, I have always felt like I have had a partner. They test things in the environment that we are going to use their products. They also make sure that if I have any questions, that I get the answer that I am looking for. Mike and the fine folks over at Radical Polymers answer the phones. Folks, when was the last time you actually talked with somebody when you had a technical support question? Well, they make your issues their issues and they get right down to the problem. They offer best-in-class technologies with the first-class support that I just mentioned. Go to scalinguph2o.com/radical to find out more. Welcome to Scaling Up, the podcast where we're scaling up on knowledge so we don't scale up our systems. Nation, my name is Trace Blackmore, and I am coming to you from AWT's technical training event in Seattle, Washington. And folks, this is my absolute favorite thing to do, to get together with other water treaters that have come to one place to learn more about what they do, to share ideas, to get better, to raise the bar in the industry. I have had so many members of the Scaling Up Nation come up to me and they let me know how much the podcast means to them. They say the podcast has made a difference in their day-to-day. Most of them have said they don't feel alone anymore, and I know exactly what they're talking about. I remember when all I did was service and it was just me and my car and I just watched the windshield from account to account. Now, it was great when we were talking to customers, but we just have so much windshield time and a lot of us don't know the best way to spend it. And that's where the idea for the podcast came. I thought it was a good idea. You all in the Scaling Up Nation confirmed it. And now we're over 10,000 people listening to the Scaling Up H2O podcast. I am just so incredibly humbled by that number, but I'm also so excited by that number. We have so many people listening to this podcast. It means that we are all caring about this industry and we all want to make it better. You know, some other things that people are coming up to me this week and telling me about is how they've learned something new or a new way to do something on this podcast. Or they were doing the same thing over and over and over again, and then something that either I said or one of my guests said sparked an idea, and now they're thinking differently about issues. And that's the real thing with issues. We can't think the same way that we did when we created the issues and expect to significantly solve them. So when we figure out ways to think differently about what we're doing, we are going to make monumentous changing. So many people have also asked me about the Rising Tide Mastermind. And folks, I got to tell you, this has become one of my favorite times each and every week where I get to get on a call with other members of the Rising Tide Mastermind. And we just talk to figure out how we make each other better. We figure out who's having an issue, we discuss that issue, we find out how we train ourselves to ask better questions. And when was the last time you even thought about that? How do you ask questions and how can you ask better questions so you can help people make better decisions, so you can get better information, so you can get decisions? Well, that's what we're doing. That's one of the many things that we're doing in the Rising Tide Mastermind. The Rising Tide Mastermind, it took off phenomenally well. We filled up 2 groups as soon as I started talking about it here on Scaling Up H2O. So I have a waiting list that has been started for the third group. Now, when we get that group filled up, we will go ahead and release that and we'll start meeting with our third group. So if you want to learn more about the Rising Tide Mastermind, you can go to scalinguph2o.com/mastermind. You can even fill out an application right there on that website. Well, Nation, I told you I am coming to you from Seattle, Washington, and if you are not here, you are missing one of the best water treatment trainings around. Now, if you did not get to come here, you have one more shot. So next month, March 18th through 21st, we are going to do this exact training in Cleveland, Ohio. So if you want to sign up for that, go to awt.org and all the information about the event will be there. And if you need one more reason to go, folks, I'm going to be there. So come by, let me know what you think of the podcast, give me some ideas, give me a high five. I love that. And just let me know that you're listening to the show. I want to introduce today's guest, and I'm trying to figure out what the best way to introduce Tom Hutchison is to you. Have you ever spoke with somebody in a crowded room and the person that you're speaking to just makes you feel like you are the only person in that room? Well, that, I think, best describes today's guest. And of course, I already said his name. His name is Tom Hutchison of HOH. And in case you're wondering, Tom is the father of Reed. Reed Hutchison was on earlier this year. He was episode 121 and 122. We were actually talking a lot about the training that we are at right now, this very moment, of course, 1 year ago. And Reed gave all sorts of great advice to why he attended both sessions, how he took notes, what he did before and after. So if you are, if you're here and you're thinking how you can even improve it, go listen to episode 121 and 122. And those are great ways to get the most out of not just the AWT technical training, but really any training that you go to. There's just no doubt about it. Father and son, Reed and Tom, are just great people. But today we are talking to Tom. And the reason we're talking to Tom Hutchison is he gave an outstanding presentation at last year's Association of Water Technologies conference on multi-generational businesses. And folks, I work with a lot of water treatment companies. And I also get coached by somebody. You've met him. His name is Tim Fulton. And he has a lot of insight on business. And he's the first to tell me that water treatment has more multi-generational businesses percentage-wise than other company industries that he has seen. So I think that means something. I think it's really cool when families can work together. Well, it's cool when it works. And I know we've talked a lot about that with some other multi-generational business owners, but when it does, it's just fantastic. And that's what he's talking about today. He's talking about what are the items that make it work, what are some things we really need to watch out, and what are some things that we need to do to prepare for what happens next. Folks, I know you are going to enjoy this interview with Tom Hutchison of HOH. My lab partner today is Tom Hutchison of HOH Water Technology. Tom, how are you today, sir?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I want to thank you for coming on Scaling Up H2O. We just saw each other a couple of weeks ago at the Association of Water Technologies annual convention and expo, and you did such a fantastic job presenting a paper on multi-generational businesses. And I just thought, what a great topic to bring on Scaling Up H2O. I presented that idea to you, and you were so gracious. You said absolutely, you would be happy to come on. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Looking forward to it.
And as our audience may or may not be aware, you and I are recording this, but it may not air until a couple of months. It absolutely will air in a couple of months. But we just saw each other at the Association of Water Technologies. So there's a whole bunch that we're going to talk about in this episode that came from that. But before we get started, I wanted to ask you if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself to the audience so they can know you just a little bit better.
Okay, well, let's see. My name's Tom Hutchison, as you said, President, CEO of HOH Water Technology. We are a 51-year-old third-generation business. My dad started the company in 1968 in Chicago. We've been a manufacturer with a laboratory facility really that whole time. I worked for the Train Corporation for a while out of college, and then I started in the family business in 1979, so 40 years in the business. And have been president of the company since 1989. As I said, third generation business. So part of the reason for me to be interested in the topic and to write the paper was I have a son in the business, Reed, who's now chief operating officer, and a son-in-law, Andy, who is our channel partner manager. And they're doing great. And so this is an exciting time for us.
Now, 40 years in the business, you had to have seen things change in water treatment. I'm curious, what are some of those things?
Well, I am so old that, when I started, by far the most common method for preventing scale and corrosion was to use an acid and zinc chromate solution. So it worked really well, right? I mean, chromate remains probably the best corrosion inhibitor ever invented, but it has some environmental issues. But I mean, it was super popular back in the 70s and the early 80s up until it was, banned by the EPA. That's a huge change. Just the technology, the development of organic materials, and also a lot of different biocides, because also back in the day, pretty much people use chlorine, maybe bromine. Now there's a lot of effective biocides for unique applications. So that technology's changed. And I think my observation from what it was like when I was in the field, in the 80s and 90s to what it's like now, that has changed a lot too. I think customers have changed. I think the market has changed. It is a different world for water treaters today. I'm old, right? So I think I know all the right answers, but I know what the right answers were in 1980. Not so sure I know what they are in 2019.
Well, something that I remember, and I actually remember the tail end of zinc chromate when I was growing up. So I wasn't actually in water treatment then, but I used to service with my father. I think I've shared on the show before that my first water treatment memory was being 5 years old, and I reached up and I burned myself on my father's hot plate when he was doing a digestion. How long has it been since we've used hot plates, right? But I remember that he would go to a cooling tower or a boiler and he would say, "That's not yellow enough. We need to turn the product up." And that was pretty much how you did those zinc chromate programs, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, we sold an acid inhibitor blend, so you had to check alkalinities or pH. But yeah, we had a boiler water product for low pressure, low makeup applications where you weren't going to use a lot of chemical. But one of the big advantages of chromate was you could just tell by looking at the sight glass what the treatment level was. It was really convenient and simple, but those were the good old days. That's what old people reminisce about.
I remember when I was very young with that. I never had experience with those programs, but by far, those are the best corrosion inhibitors I think we will ever see. You just can't use them anymore.
Yep.
Well, I'm curious, could you ever see yourself doing something else being in water treatment for 40 years?
Well, in my case, you mean like what are my plans for the next 10 years, or what would I have done if I wasn't a water treater?
I think I like both questions.
Okay, so it might be a complicated answer, but if I wasn't a water treater, I'd probably be in the ministry. We talked about me going to seminary late in life. I went to seminary when I was 50. And then I actually was on staff at a church part-time. So I've obviously got a passion for that. And, in a different time, that's what I might have done. I think that what I would do differently going forward is probably more to do with, trying to influence and encourage, I think, leaders, right? So it wouldn't have to be necessarily in the water treatment industry, although I'm grateful for like this opportunity. But, I think I've developed some skills and have some wisdom around the whole subject of leadership and strategy. And I really do enjoy that. So the next phase of life hopefully includes some of that.
I can't remember who said it, and I'm going to mess the quote up, so I'll paraphrase it. But somebody said the mark of a true leader was how many other leaders they create. Have you heard that?
No, but that's definitely a big part of it. I think if, and even in terms of building a business, we'll probably get into this more in a minute, but if it all depends on you, and if you're not around and you don't have a team that can, pick up the pieces, then at least, for a really important part of your job, you've really not done it well. So, yeah, I agree with the quote for sure. The simple quote I've heard that I've always resonated with me is, you're a leader if people are following you. So, you might think you're a leader, but if you turn around and nobody's walking behind you, you might want to check that again.
Tom, as I mentioned at the top of the show, we just came back from the Association of Water Technologies convention, and you gave a presentation about multi-generational businesses. And there's so many topics around that. We had a young professionals panel where Reed was part of, your son, where people are trying to understand the millennial generation. And then we have so many people in the Association of Water Technologies that is trying to figure out what they're going to do with the next level of their business, how they're going to pass that to someone or what they're going to do with it. I just recently had an expert on this show. His name was Jeff Butler, and he was episode 104. And he spoke all about generational diversity and how now we have 4 generations working together and they all do things differently. So I am curious, with all that information, what was the reason that you decided you wanted to take your valuable time and interview? I think you interviewed 40 different water treaters to figure out what was going on multi-generationally in their businesses and how those businesses were going to pass to the next generation.
Well, I think the impetus to do anything was a desire to give back to AWT. I mean, the organization is really benefiting us right now, and we've been a member a long time. And so I was glad to do something in response. And the subject of a lasting impact in multi-generational companies, it's really important to me and to my family. So, as I said at the beginning, we're a 3rd generation business, and the transition is not unique to me, but the transition from my dad to me was successful, I guess, but also very, very bumpy. And we're a lot larger now than we were then, and so it gets complicated, I think, that much more to try to transition it to my son and my son-in-law. So we've done a lot of work on it. We turned 50 years old last year and celebrated our past and took that opportunity to strategically plan for the future. So it's a really important subject to all of us here at HOH. And I thought, well, we're not the only company in that position. So yeah, we reached out to 40 companies just to kind of see what their experience has been. Ended up talking to and interviewing 22, which I thought was the response was great. That's a pretty high percentage, to get people. Some of these people don't know me from Adam, and yet they were willing to talk and be pretty transparent. So really enjoyed the process.
Did you find by interviewing these 22 people that most of them had a transition plan already in place?
I'd have to look at my notes. I would say the majority did. I was surprised. And some of the companies I knew and was surprised even from what I know of them that they did. Yeah, I would say more companies had plans in place than did not. But definitely a minority of companies really had a plan that was, I would say, thorough or really had already kind of been fully executed. So it's, I think it's always a work in progress, but there were more companies than not that were actively working it.
What were some of the things that you learned during the interview process?
I think the biggest thing I learned is that, and this is, AWT members know this in general, but you're not unique. And when you get to talk to people, when you're in kind of relationship, you realize that whatever challenges and kind of tensions and struggles and opportunities that you have, virtually every other company has. You can talk about size and all of that, but it often comes down to people. And so I was really just appreciative to hear other people's stories because I think we learn well from other people's stories. And so I said this in my talk. I hung up the phone, I think, virtually with every interview I did. And I'm like, wow, that was really encouraging. That was good for me because you realize you're not alone. I guess what I learned was everybody is in the same boat regarding the subject.
Do you remember any specific conversations that really remind you of that?
Yeah, there were a few. There were some, sons of business owners, guys who I knew didn't understand all of the hard work that went into the planning with their parents. And they were, very honest to say how hard it was, also how glad they were to be through it. And those conversations were good for me to hear because, we're just kind of in the process, with my son and my son-in-law. So I was really glad to get that encouragement. The other thing that I was encouraged by was a lot of times, you hear statistics that like, a second generation business, those guys don't care as much as the first because, it's not their baby, they didn't start it. And then it gets worse, right? Third generation people are more entitled, fourth generation, even more entitled. But man, the second and third generation people that I talked to were anything but entitled. They were committed. They had a sense of vision. And, that was really encouraging because I was struck by, how they took the legacy that their parents had created. They took that really seriously, and it was really benefiting their companies going forward. I had one guy who said, so there were uncles in the business, and the uncles were not the greatest owners, looking to cash out as much as they could of the business, and yet their dad was a hard worker. And I said to the guy, I said, so you're like a fourth generation owner, and so how is it that that you take your job so seriously and you do it so well? And he said, well, it was my dad's example, and he got emotional as he said it. He said he remembered his dad coming home every night, and he would sit in front of the TV, in his chair, and he would open up his briefcase, and he described this like us sitting in a chair and opening up our laptop. But he'd watch his dad night after night open up his chair or open up his briefcase sitting in his chair and do his work. And the impact it had on him and his brother, his lasting impact, right? It's helped them be really successful today. That was one particular story that was really encouraging.
Yeah, I have certain memories like that of my father. He was always finishing up paperwork. I remember him doing lab testing on the kitchen table. That's where I actually started my career in water treatment. I made something turn from one color to the other. I had no idea what I was doing at the time.
I worked in production for my dad, and one of my favorite jobs was driving a truck. I love that because you're out on the road and you're driving a truck and you think you're a big deal. And then at some point, I said, "Hey, I want to carry a test kit." And I was like, I don't know, 19 maybe or something. I didn't have any experience. But I remember being in an account. It was in Wisconsin, and I was doing like a point of use delivery. And while I was there, I took a sample of the tower water just for fun. And I ran the tests that I was supposed to run. And the readings I got just didn't make any sense to me because they weren't what they were supposed to be, and I didn't know what to do. So I called my dad. I said, "Hey, Dad, I don't know what's going on, but these are the readings I'm getting." And it turned out, I don't know, they were probably overfeeding acid. So there was like 0 M alkalinity, or something like that. And it was fun because it was really helpful. So my dad called the service guy. The service guy got over there in a couple hours, fixed the problem. But that was my first testing experience. And I remember that feeling pretty cool.
And it sounds like you saved an account because if they were overfeeding acid, that wasn't too long until disaster struck.
Never know. I might have.
You mentioned statistics about companies, and I'm pretty sure you did this research. Do you know what the statistics are for companies that have handed over to another generation on how well they actually survive?
Yeah, it's not, the data is not encouraging. It's something like 50% of second generation businesses, are successful. I think I want to say 15% of third generation businesses are successful. And then 5% are fourth generation that make it. So the odds are stacked against you. And it points to the need to be intentional, about transition.
Do you think, in your opinion, that is what the issue is? People aren't intentional, and then by default, the transition happens, and that's why they're not successful?
I think that's exactly the reason. I don't have the data. My son-in-law, who's part of this family business council through Loyola University, said in one of his classes, the reasons business don't make it to the next generation is not because their product stopped working or because their service stopped being effective. It's virtually always because of a relationship, breakdown in the organization.
I'm curious, was there something you heard over and over again during your interviews?
If I was going to summarize it, a good number of people that have been successful would say it like this: this was really, really, really hard, and I'm really, really glad I did it.
Oh, there you go.
So, there were some companies who aren't being intentional yet. And again, my dad was not intentional. So this is not to cast any stones. We're all in the same boat. But there were a few people who said, yeah, I don't think this is going to be that hard. And was it my place to offer commentary or advice? But, I'm thinking, well, yeah, it's actually going to be really hard because I kept hearing that over and over again. I also know what it was like, when my dad transitioned to me, which was really pretty bad. But yeah, I think the general sense is this is really, really hard and it's really, really worth it. And for me, there is nothing more important with regards to HOH than for me to make sure that I've properly transitioned this to the next generation because nothing else matters after.
Was there anything that you heard that really surprised you?
The one comment I got that was surprising, but surprising in a very good way, when I called the individual, we set up the interview, and I'd sent him an email with the questions. And he gave so much thought to the questions, and it was really around the family dynamic. So that was really important to him. And he had 3 main points, which I can't remember to tell you now. But what I was surprised by the depth of insight he had. So yeah, I think maybe if I was going to say surprised, Trace, it'd be like, I was surprised at how deeply so many people have actually thought about this subject. Again, that was very exciting and encouraging to me.
Well, I will say I was in the audience when you were delivering this presentation, and I sat around several people that were part of the interview process. And occasionally you would put a quote up and they would say, I told him that. That was my quote. Everybody was so proud of your being in your presentation.
Well, I tried to keep it anonymous, but if they were going to self-identify, that's, I can't really.
You can't help that. My next question is, after all this interviewing, I'm sure you found some things that you thought were interesting, some things you didn't think were interesting. But after all that came out in the wash, did you learn anything that you would have done differently had you have known about it?
Well, I think this is going to sound really tactical, and I still have time to address it. I think the best transition stories involved the older generation really selling, getting their money out of the business, and having the younger generation literally buy it. So, there's obviously the option where you gift stock or whatever. And that's a decision that, each individual is free to make. But I feel like the best transition stories almost always involved a financial, stake in the game on the part of the successor generation. And I don't know if that was surprising to me. That was more convicting to me that I need to address that. That's hard to do, and then those are hard conversations to have. And one quote I had from one company was simply this, because they'd had a tough experience with a stepmother. Is money does weird things to people, and yeah, it does weird things in the best of families, right? And so it's a hard conversation to have. But if you don't have it, it's just like leaving the elephant in the room and you're asking for resentments. So I think the best stories were those where the financial plan was really, really clear and successful. And I need to myself make sure I take that seriously.
Well, let's get into the nuts and bolts of your presentation, because you actually gave us a process in what we should be doing. You said we need to start with why. We need to self-assess, and we need to get and use resources. So I thought we could start with that. When you say start with why, what do you mean?
Well, I took that from the title of a book by an author named Simon Sinek, Designed for Leaders. And I think that sometimes, especially for those of us who've been doing this a long time, you get stuck in the day-to-day grind of what you're doing and how you're doing it. The job of treating water, the job of taking care of customers. And you can get in that grind and forget or take the passion that you had when you started the business. You tend to take that for granted. So Sinek's point, from a leadership point of view, if you're just going through the motions, not even realizing you're going through the motions, your company's going to follow you and they'll just go through the motions as well. And eventually just going through the motions is going to provide mediocre service. And that's what none of us want to do. And so his encouragement is to start with why, just to refocus a company culture as to what made it not just successful, but what made it exciting to work for, And then when you figure out, okay, how's the next generation going to survive? It's worth doing the work to say, okay, what was this like driving principle, this core value, whatever you want to call it, that my dad, for example, had that worked for him, that not only worked for him, but then worked for people who saw something in him and wanted to follow that. And then what do I do with that, and how does that translate into the next generation? So that's work that is like, it's going to feel like, I got to go service this account. I've got to make sure billing's correct, blah, blah, blah. And so to be intentional about, getting away from the office, whatever it looks like, and saying, okay, we're going to sit around and brainstorm, why we exist. It sounds pretty existential. We found that really helpful. And, it's not that easy. It takes hard work to get it to a succinct point where you can clarify it, in a vision statement or passion statement or whatever. But I have found, as we've done this work over the last couple of years, it's been some of the most important work we've done.
I recently interviewed Cliff Robinson of Chick-fil-A. He's the COO, and he said when they sat down and started clarifying, their why, what their mission was, everything started to come together for them.
And I think that's true for us. We've gone through a lot of organizational upheaval over the last few years, and really at a high level, at the management team level. And as we've made those changes, it sort of forced us to say, okay, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And yeah, I mean, sometimes when you find yourself in a really difficult situation, it's helpful to remember that's just an opportunity for you to get better. That's definitely been our case, because we had to stop and say, okay, how did we get to this point? And how do we get back to why we exist? What's our reason why? So yeah, I mean, I totally get it. Does change everything. You don't see it. You don't see it in like sales the next day. You don't see it in. Nothing gets better overnight, but it becomes a guiding principle that you stick by as you say, okay, this is how we're going to build, or this is how we're going to redirect the culture. So I agree with what he said.
Yeah, Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, is one of my favorite books. He does a great job of explaining to you how you can explain to people that buy your wares, how you explain their why. And he uses Apple Computer, Martin Luther King Jr., I think the Wright brothers are in there. It's a fantastic book. In fact, I'm going to try to put the TED Talk that he did on my show notes page so people can see exactly what we're talking about. I'm curious, have you read his book, Leaders Eat Last?
Some of it. Yeah, I didn't finish it, but I did.
Yeah, he's just fantastic. He came to Atlanta not too terribly long ago, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to get tickets to go see him. But he is a fantastic author. He's done several TED Talks. So, Nation, if you're out there and you're in some sort of leadership role, he really does a great job of summing up what the mindset of a true leader, in my opinion, needs to think like.
I'll just tell one anecdote from there, and maybe this benefits smaller water treaters out there. So you mentioned the Wright brothers. At the same time, the Wright brothers were trying to figure out how to fly a plane. I think his name was Samuel Langley, and he was just this high-profile, I want to say, professor of technology, like at MIT, well-funded, well-known, connected politically, and he was very publicly trying to be the first person to fly. And so he had all these resources, and yet the Wright brothers just had people from whatever small town in Ohio they were from. They had no resources, but what they had was a common goal together. And they won the race, right? Because they had a reason why. Langley's reason why was to gain fame and fortune. The Wright brothers was to do something no one ever done before, and that was a much more compelling vision. And Sinek talks about that in the book. But I love that because water treaters, whatever our size, but generally we worry sometimes because we're smaller in corporate purchasing and the big players gobbling up smaller companies. But if their why tends to get fuzzy and your why is focused, I'll put my chips on the people who understand why.
That's a great point. And there's so much that can come when you understand your why as an owner, but then also when your people understand that why. It empowers them to make decisions when you're not there. And in most times, those decisions are going to be even better than the ones that you would have made. Well, your next process was self assess. And you gave us three areas to do that. You said there was family dynamics, organizational transition, and financial. Can we speak on each one of those?
And when I did this, I rehearsed the talk the night before. My wife and my daughter and daughter-in-law were in town with us. And I said, okay, so which one of these three, the family dynamics, the organizational transition, or the financial part, makes you a little bit, twitch a little bit? And my daughter right away said family dynamics because she knows, like, hey, hard family conversations are not easy, as I said before, for the best of families. In the paper and in the talk, we referenced really two parts of family dynamics to pay attention to. One of these is the successor's credibility. So, let's talk about my story, I guess. I think when I started with the company, I was 25, right? So I had my engineering degree, an MBA, really thought I was pretty cool. The people in the company, though, remembered me as this high school and college kid making deliveries. And they also knew I was the boss's son. They had no idea if I had any ability to do anything, and my dad was still pretty active. And so it was important for me to figure out how to earn credibility. Number one, I had to believe in myself. Now, I came in with a lot of confidence. It helped that I worked for another company, I think, and gained some confidence there. But then I also had to earn what I called in the talk external credibility. So I had to get other people to actually begin to believe that, yeah, I could be someone they could follow someday. That's so important to get credibility, and it's up to the successor. So the younger generation has to take that responsibility, but then the older generation can really help that transition by, giving them chances to demonstrate leadership or to demonstrate technical competency by not bailing them out. That's probably a huge one. Maybe you went through that yourself, but it's sort of like if the dad rushes in and bails out the son every time, he's never going to get a chance to earn external credibility. In my case, it was exact opposite regarding that. My dad loved to watch me fail, and I hated it. Took it personally, but I will tell you that every time I screwed something up, I learned that much faster, what I was doing. So internal, external credibility, that's a big piece of the family dynamics, I would say. And then I think another part of that is, this idea of letting go. And so you have to kind of have an idea like in my generation, I have to be willing to let go, even if I'm not really sure that I can trust, the people who are taking over. And that lack of trust could be because they aren't ready from an ability point of view, but they could be more than ready. And yet I have to deal with the reality that I'm afraid to let go, that I'm entrusting my financial future to my kids, for example. And there's a pride piece that says, hey, no one can do this job as good as me. So those are two kind of examples of family dynamic conversations that, frankly, need to be ongoing.
Tom, do you think that part of the conversation is just so difficult because you're talking about somebody not being here anymore?
There's definitely a piece of that, and I think then, so in the best families, where you don't want to see your parents go away, but you also want to be able to spread your wings. Yeah, there's definitely a conflict there. Yeah, so yeah, there is that piece, no doubt. I think it's more than that, but I think that's part of it.
I, of course, started my own company, so I didn't go through this with my father, but both my grandfather and my father have passed away, and they both looked at that so incredibly differently. My grandfather had absolutely everything planned out. So when it did happen, I knew where everything was. He had things written down, instructions on what to do. Now, my father, he never wanted to talk about that. We actually had conversations about what would happen in the event that he did pass away, and he never wanted to talk about that. So I could just imagine if we did own a water treatment company together, that he would have passed and everything would have been up in the air, and I don't know if we would have survived that or not.
That's my experience. So my dad died when he was 74. And if you knew him, he would have told you he planned to live to be 100, right? So you're going to live to be 100. I don't really need to do any financial planning or estate planning. And so he died with really no estate plan. Now, I had been in the business at that point for I had been president for like 7 years. So in terms of the day-to-day operation of the business, I had a pretty good handle on that. There were a lot of estate things that were going to be taxing, but I should say taxing in quotes, because not having any estate planning, he also didn't really have any financial estate plan. And, you hear horror stories of what happens when that's the case, because you're going to pay estate taxes. And it all comes down to how a business is valued. And in our case, we just were fortunate that, our appraisal was appraised really, really low, and the IRS accepted that appraisal. And so we had enough cash in my dad's profit sharing to pay estate taxes. But if it had been valued at what the market value was at the time, we would have had to sell the business. So it's not an easy conversation for, let's say, a son to have with a father about, hey, Dad, I need this opportunity. This is part of my credibility building process. The other thing that we talked about was, especially in extended families, is this idea of good owners versus bad owners. And so there are good owners who see themselves as stewards of a resource, that they care deeply about their customers and employees. They view their job as a responsibility and not as an entitlement. And, by far, probably everyone I talk to is in that camp. But you also hear stories about, say, an owner who's not involved in the business, could be a cousin or an uncle, whatever the case may be, stepmother, and they only view the business as an asset to sort of be milked. They don't care about the employees. They become not only a cash drain on the business, but a huge emotional and mental distraction. And so it's best to, as early in the process as you can, identify someone who really shouldn't be owning the business, because they're just not going to, they're going to always be kind of a thorn in the side, and have that frank conversation too, and then execute a financial plan to get them out. Because there are a few stories involving lawsuits, and, it's bad enough that affects the business, but it wrecks family relationships as well. And so again, having the hard conversation, it's hard, but will always be better for having had it rather than avoiding it.
Would you say it's only hard at first and then you get through that?
My guess from people talking to me is that it's hard all the time until you're done, So, maybe the whole transition process takes 2 years or 3 years. I mean, it can easily take that or more. It's like a day-to-day discipline, and so discipline sometimes not easy. It's just that I heard repeatedly from the interviews when they were done with it, though, they ranked. I asked people to score what they thought of the success of the transition process, and so many people scored it a 10 out of 10. But when they were in it, a few people would say it felt like it was 3 out of 10. Because it just was like, God, is this ever going to end? Are we ever going to get to a resolution on this point?
Maybe that means the score goes up when you actually get through it.
That is what it means. That's exactly what it means.
So you mentioned step 2 was organizational transition. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, 2 pieces to that. So I mentioned the letting go piece. And the biggest thing to say about that is face your fears. People who are in an ownership position of a water treatment company are, they have this exalted status. Even if they don't have an ego themselves, they're still up on a pedestal. And that's easy. And then that's an isolating place. But then there's a persona that you feel like you have to maintain. And admitting that you're afraid of anything can be viewed as a sign of weakness. But I think that it's okay. It's actually, I think, healthy to admit that you're afraid of letting go. You got to deal with that, because the trust issue then becomes what's going on inside of you, not so much how the organization is running. So face the fear of letting go, number one, and that's your job. Secondly, is pay attention to how the leaders are being developed. And there's a variety of resources for this, but it's to be intentional. So I'll say, like in our case, both my son and my son-in-law have been in structured programs and in one-on-one mentorship. And in the case of one-on-one mentorship, I'm not involved. And frankly, probably some of the days I'm a topic of conversation. They're frustrated and they naturally need a place to be able to talk about that stuff. So developing leadership skills and then developing technical skills. So an obvious example of that is having the successor generation get their CWT certification. But you need a leadership plan, because you might be fine with letting go, but you're not going to trust the business to someone who doesn't have the character that they don't have and who doesn't have the technical competence. You want to make sure there's a plan to get that. Lots of resources there, but again, you got to be sort of intentional because I'm saying to Reed, hey, Reed, you need to grow in this area. And we're good at talking like that, but that can be a painful conversation. So in terms of the whole area of organizational transition, that's a big piece.
Tom, you mentioned meeting with a third party, and I've been doing that for years. Something I like to say on the show is you don't know what you don't know. And I actually learned that from my business coach, Tim Fulton. And he has recommended so many wonderful books for me to read when it comes to business. And I remember one of them was called Dance in the End Zone. And I can't remember what the subtitle was. It was something like the Business Owner's Exit Planning Playbook or something like that. It had a football theme. He said there were 4 ways that you can transition a business. There was one that he called passers, and passers looked for a family member in their company that they could transition to. There was an outie, and an outie looked for an outside third party that they could sell to. There was an innie, and an innie was looking for a trusted employee that they could transition to. And then the fourth one was called a squeezer. They just really didn't care what happened to the business when they were gone. They were just going to squeeze every last drop out of it. I'm curious, in your research and developing this paper, did you find that those were 4? Did I leave some out? What do you think?
I think it's actually a pretty inclusive list. And I probably heard stories of all 4 of those. The multi-generational kind of tack of the paper refers to, I guess you call it the passers, right? Trying to get it to the next generation. But there was one not so good story where there was a son intending to inherit the business and his father sold it to someone else. So instead of passing, he went to being an outie. That was hard to hear, but again, he survived it, right? He survived it and came out of it stronger. But I wouldn't wish that on anybody, I don't think. I also heard some companies who don't necessarily have a family member to pass it to, who are looking at it could be employees, so it could be an ESOP, for example, or a key management member or a key management team that could do the exit strategy. And then there were a couple businesses where there wasn't a successor identified, where the company might have been smaller. And the squeezer, that's probably not fair to describe these companies this way, but they realized that this is what they were going to do until they closed the doors. And they were okay with that. That was the best option they saw. So I heard all 4 examples.
Did you hear one more than another?
Well, definitely the passing. Because I think the interest, even in talking to me, was people who are in the middle of the same thing that I'm going through.
And then, of course, there's the financial component to that. Can you speak a little on that?
That is be intentional and deal with a very sensitive subject, because you want a clear financial plan. And I think it's very appropriate for the existing generation or the current generation to want to get their investment out. In fact, if they don't, they run the risk of setting up a really unhealthy relationship 20 or 30 years from now. So one story to that point, there was somebody in their 50s talking to them and successful, and I think they love their parents, but wanting to invest in the business. But there really hadn't been any kind of financial transfer. And so now the 80-year-old parents, this was still their livelihood. And so they're dependent on that livelihood. They've gotten used to it, and they're reluctant to invest in the business growth. Now, I actually get their point of view. At 80, I think I would feel the same way. But if they had a financial plan identified that worked, let's say 30 years ago, neither, the child nor the parent would be in this position. So the financial thing is just simply this: have a clear exit, have it in writing. It might involve a buy-sell agreement. You might have to spend money on lawyers, God forbid. And have a goal, I think, and I heard this a lot, have a goal that, okay, I need to get my money out of the business. It's the right thing to do, but I don't want to burden my son or my daughter. And I heard stories, more than one story, where, the owner slowed down the amount of money, or they reduced it so that they didn't put a unnecessary burden on the successor generation. So simply put, have a clear written financial exit strategy and just have a commitment that you won't make it a financial burden on the next generation.
I'm curious, of all the people you interviewed, how many actually had a buy and sell agreement?
Yeah, more than I thought. But I would say out of 22, I would say at least 6 or 7.
Yeah, and when you think about a document like that, the things that I would think of, I'm not going to think about everything that an attorney would think of. I recently went through this process and he brought things into the picture that I just wouldn't have thought of. And then also ways to calculate the worth of the business.
Yeah, and that has to be part of a buy sell agreement is a independent valuation. Or you can just agree ahead of time, as long as everybody's in agreement and you put it in writing, we're going to value this business at whatever, a certain multiple of earnings or a dollar for dollar sales, whatever an agreed upon measure is. You can do that, but you have to all have agreement. The flip side of that is, to pay a valuator, which will cost more money, but that's definitely probably a more independent and probably objective appraisal.
The last thing that you recommended that everybody used during this process was to get good resources. What are some of the resources you recommend?
Well, I'm going to say number one for me, it's kind of get some advisors around you who you trust. It could be people in the community who are successful business owners. It could be your accountant. It could be a financial planner. It could be a friend that you trust, but open yourself up to like the wisdom of a group and be intentional about that. Don't really think you can figure this out because it's a very, especially when you get to the financial piece of this, it's a very technical subject. So there are a lot of peer groups that you can be a part of. For me, I've been part of an advisory group now for 5 years. It's been, I will say, simply life-changing. But one of the areas that they will help hold me accountable in is, the formation of an advisory board somewhere down the road. So that's the best wisdom, I think, for the whole process is to get some advisors on your team who you trust. There are also a lot of resources available in the industry. I listed a bunch in the paper, but for example, you've heard of Patrick Lencioni. So he's a leadership author, and he has an organization called the Table Group, and they will help set up strategic planning, for companies. That's what they exist to do. We might talk about EOS. That's another system that's popular. Frankly, there are a bunch of them out there, but be intentional about looking for them. There are national resources, but there are a lot that are local. The other category of resources I ought to throw in here too is, so I needed to get wisdom. I needed to get people that could hold me accountable. But then, going back to the leadership development piece, look for resources for the next generation who needs development, right? So like what kind of mentor do they need? What kind of, business training do they need? Is it at a local university? For us in Chicago, Loyola University's Graduate School of Business has a really excellent family business center. There were 2 different people who mentioned, and I'm not going to be able to think of the name of it. It was a Goldman Sachs leadership training program, and 2 people just raved about that. So there's lots of resources for kind of that leadership development piece too. But, don't assume that you're going to develop your son or daughter because you know so much. There's a lot of dynamics there, Get some wisdom around that and take advantage of that as well.
You mentioned Patrick Lencioni. I had somebody from the Table Group interview on the show. He was actually episode 45. His name was Rick Packer. And I was just so impressed with everything that Patrick Lencioni wrote. And it's amazing because we're getting ready to talk about EOS, but when you look at what Patrick Lencioni writes versus Vern Harnish of Scaling Up versus Gino Wickman of Traction, they're so similar.
They are. And so, my experience is they all are focused on the same principles. It's just, if nothing else, it's a language. It's clear language around those principles. Lencioni's book on that subject is called The Advantage.
It sounds like we have a very similar reading list.
Sounds like
it. I'm curious, when is the best time to start talking about a transition like this?
Yesterday.
Understood. Well, we brought up EOS, so I want to get straight into that because you and I immediately connected on EOS. I've been doing EOS for a little better than 5 years, and you guys, how long?
That's about us too. I think we started in 2014.
Okay. So for those of you out there in the Scaling Up Nation that don't know what we are talking about the entrepreneurial operating system. And that was from a book that Gino Wickman wrote called Traction. And I just got so much freedom when I read that book. And I would have never heard of that book had it not been from the Vistage format that I go to every single month. And I meet with other business owners, and somebody recommended that to me. And while reading that book, it gave me the freedom to realize that I didn't have to be good at absolutely everything that has to happen in the company. And there are other people that could do that, but you have to have a set of parameters to make sure that everybody is doing everything that they're supposed to be doing. We're all tracking toward a particular number, and we have a way of knowing where everything is at any moment in time. And that all boiled down was the entrepreneurial operating system. I've heard several water treatment companies that use EOS, and I've heard lots of other companies that use EOS because EOS does not care what type of business that you have. You just plug in what you do to it. I've had a couple of people on the show to talk about EOS. And Tom, that's one of the great things about having your own podcast. You get these high level people like yourself that you could just get free advice from. And two of those people were Mark Williams. He was on episode 38. And then Mike Payton, who I believe is now the CEO of EOS, he was episode 85. So now that the nation knows what EOS is, I'm curious, why did you decide that you needed something called EOS?
Yeah, and it was a foundational decision, and I don't mean to make that sound more grand than it was. It was nothing more important, I would say. So I joined a group similar to Vistage called Convene back in 2014. And I would say I joined the group somewhat out of desperation because we were as large as we had ever been as a corporation in terms of sales, but we weren't nearly as profitable as I thought we should have been. Culture-wise, we weren't where we wanted to be. And so I was kind of grasping. And so I got invited into this group called Convene. And one of the first meetings, just like you, exactly like you, one of the presenting companies said, "This is a system we're using at our business." And I'm like, that's what we got to do, So I got excited. I read the traction book, just like you. And I got to a place in the book where they describe documenting what they call your core processes. And I don't want to get into the details, but basically he talked about at the end of this process, you're going to have a binder that's going to be called, the HOH way. And that sold it for me. I'm like, that's what I've wanted for a long time. I want to codify what I think is the HOH way, like what makes us different in the industry, and that had been particularly elusive. But now here was a system that really, if you just followed it, was going to allow you to get to that place. So we started that process, and it's just kind of like with this whole subject today, I guess we can say, it's simple, but it's definitely not easy. And, our leadership team has, it's about 100% turnover. I think there's one person on our leadership team who was there when we started in 2014. One of the big pieces, Trace, and this, is like kind of an accountability chart. And if you're going to do this well, you have to deal with, okay, do I have the right people in the right seats? And that can involve even in the leadership of the company. And that's where you need the accountability to say, okay, you've identified that you might have the right person, high character, but they're just in the wrong seat. And you got to make a change. And a lot of what we've done started with that, but it's really transformed how we do things. And like I say, it's just key to how we operate these days.
I will tell you that when we first started EOS, we had some pushback. And we later found that those people weren't necessarily the right people for our company. And they ended up leaving because of the things that EOS laid out. And today, I still keep in contact with some of them. They're so much happier working in another field. And now we found somebody that is the right person, and they are just doing amazing work. Had it not been for EOS, we wouldn't have found the right person for that seat. But even worse, there would be a person in that seat that wasn't happy coming to work every day. EOS is just amazing, the accountability chart and all the different things. If you're curious about that, we talk about all those tools on episodes 38 and 85. But I'm curious, I shared a little bit about my experience. What happened when you guys started EOS? Was everybody for it?
No, because it was uncomfortable. I mean, you go through the the work. And I mean, number one, there's the regular habit of meetings, and no one likes meetings, but yet meetings are the lifeblood of an organization. It's not that you don't need meetings, you just need productive, efficient meetings. So we had to get in the rhythm of meetings. We started holding people more accountable, because if you're going to follow the system, accountability is part of it. Not just for financial targets, but it's just, do what you say you're going to do. People didn't like that. I would say there was pushback for that. We had a Salesforce, and the Salesforce leader was not implementing it to our entire Salesforce. So half of our company really wasn't involved in the process. So yeah, there was, I would say, a lot of pushback. It does start though with you, and it starts with the leadership team. And so for us, it was a process of getting on the same page as a leadership team, because then the phrase is you can cascade what needs to be communicated down throughout the organization and trust that it's going to happen. Whenever you're dealing with change, and whenever you're dealing with like restructuring an organization, there's always going to be pushback.
What are some differences that you see today that came directly from using the Entrepreneur Operating System?
Well, my employees, when they listen to this, they'll think this is funny, but our communication has gotten better. If people were going to say, what's our single biggest challenge today, they're probably going to say it's communication. So we have a lot of work to do. But it is so much better, and it's better because of the rhythm of EOS to have, weekly meetings and quarterly offsite meetings. So our communication is better. I think that our accountability is better than it's ever been in our history. Again, that makes some people uncomfortable, and it forces some hard decisions. But everybody wants everyone else to be held accountable, and so it's a really healthy thing. So I think the accountability piece has been good. I would say at this point, Trace, maybe the single biggest thing today versus when we started in 2014 is I have a leadership team. We're all engaged. We all are on the same mission. Whereas when I started, there was even pushback on the leadership team. Now, it doesn't mean we always agree. And we have heated exchanges, fairly regularly in our Monday morning meetings. But probably the biggest change is I think the leadership team of HOH now is as strong as it's ever been. And it has a whole lot to do with the structure of EOS.
You've been using EOS for 5 years. What do you know now that you wish you knew when you were implementing the process?
I don't know. What comes to mind is I wish I knew then how hard it was going to be, especially regarding people. But on the other hand, if I really knew how hard it was going to be regarding, people decisions, that I didn't want to make, I might not have made them, So I think that when, the thing about EOS is they give you a really simple formula, and they don't sugarcoat that it's going to be hard, but sometimes they just don't communicate how hard it is. Much like this whole idea of, multi-generational planning, right? You're glad when you've gone through the process. When you're in the middle of it, though, it's not fun. Maybe a heads up would have been nice.
Well, they probably wouldn't have sold as many books if they did that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Last year, you spoke at the Association of Water Technologies Business Owners Conference, specifically on EOS. What kind of questions was the audience asking you?
I remember the questions for me regarded the organizational changes that I tried to be transparent about. So let me get back to the accountability piece. For us as an organization, EOS has been an important part. Probably an even more important part is this advisory group called Convene that I'm in. Because what happens is, if I'm not held accountable to make hard decisions, the data that EOS provides you is useless, right? And so what I shared a little bit last year was, this, major changeover of our leadership team. And that got people's attention, because I'll tell you, Trace, like in every organization, unfortunately, well, it's just human nature, right? You're going to have, EOS uses this term, I'll explain it for people, the right person in the right seat. So the right person is defined as the individual who lives to your core values. We have 4 core values. And so we've got a lot of right people in our organization. I'm a huge percentage, very proud of that. And then are they in the right seat, i.e., are they in the right job? Do they get the job? Do they actually want the job? Do they have the ability to do it? So we do this right person, right seat analysis. And you're talking about messing with people who you're probably friends with, long-term employees who you care deeply about. And you recognize that they're maybe really not the right person. More often in our case, they weren't in the right seat. And so I think the reaction I got at the owners meeting was some people were just thinking to themselves, I've got I've got one or two people in my organization that I feel that way about. And so they asked a lot about how that was. I think that it's always the people. So EOS, gives you metrics, and there's 6 different pieces to the system, but there's a people component, and without a doubt, it's always people. So that's what I remember from that, is just they're looking to me sincerely saying, how do I do this with my team?
I remember having conversations with other Association of Water Technologies members, and I would talk to them about EOS. And a lot of them would say, oh, we already do that. We already do that. And when you really talk to them about what they're doing, they're not doing anywhere near that. So I was just curious if that came up at all.
In New Orleans, it did not, but I see that a lot in kind of the EOS community that I'm in. Again, I think that's human nature. This is going to sound like a bizarre analogy, but I deal a lot in kind of the recovery world. And so picture an addict who knows he needs to stop drinking, and he says he stopped drinking, but really on the side he still is. He's not really embraced the program, right? And so you have people who are kind of, and we would use the phrase, he's working at recovery, but he's not really in recovery. So the same thing applies to EOS and a variety of other disciplines. You're kind of working at EOS, but you haven't really, bought into the system. And it shows. It shows in the frustration that comes out in terms of a lack of results and a lack of focus and stuff.
Earlier, you spoke about level 10 meetings, and that is how EOS really redefines the meeting. Most meetings that we sit through outside of EOS could have been done in an email. Level 10 meetings are exactly what they need to be, and they're actually really great meetings. One of the things that I'll do is I'll sit in on level 10 meetings of other businesses, and they'll do the same thing with me. And I'll just critique what's going on, and they'll do the same. And I remember I was sitting in at one company, and they had about 7 people on their leadership team, which I thought was a bit much, but they didn't ask me about that. But what they did is everybody gave the rating a 10. And at best, I would have given it a 4. So I'm curious, when you are developing EOS, do you feel that it is of worth to find someone else that's going through EOS? And I'm wondering if you've done that.
Probably haven't talked to other water treatment companies doing EOS, but we paid a lot of attention to, I think they're called facilitators, the consultants who really help set it up. A piece of advice would be, if people are contemplating this, take your advisor's advice seriously. So we talk about working at EOS versus embracing it. One way to embrace it is to do what your advisor tells you. Don't overthink it. Don't reinvent the wheel. We don't use an advisor now. We're on our own. But for the first 2 years, we really tried to follow exactly what they told us to do without overthinking it. And I think that was huge. And again, for me, I'm just going to say, as president of the company, I need a board, or I need some people who can hold me accountable to actually do what I'm saying I'm going to do. Again, and that's a really surefire way to know if the program's getting implemented. I'll talk to my EOS, the guy who set us up originally, and I'll tell him where we're at, kind of the things we've been doing. And he's always very positive because he knows our history, and he's like, wow, you've really followed through on stuff. And that's always encouraging for me to hear.
We did bring up the Association of Water Technologies Business Owners Conference. You not only went there last year, you spoke last year. So for the listeners out there in the Scaling Up Nation, if they were to go to that, what can they expect?
I think the value for me has been, it's a focus group of people who have kind of the same mission, right? So, if you go to the AWT convention, you've got 3 tracks, could be technical, could be sales development, and it could be an ownership track. But, the ownership meetings that I've been at have been good because you're just with other owners. So you're dealing with the issues that you probably most often deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I think the committee's done a good job of providing resources to address those specific issues. So you won't be talking about, a technical problem or a new product innovation. You're going to be talking about, legal issues and, estate planning issues, whatever owners have to deal with, when they're not doing the business of water treatment. So it's a good, it's always good to get away from the business. The phrase is, and I don't think EOS invented this, but you want to be working on your business as opposed to in it, right? So when you're in it, it gets back to what we said originally. When you're in it, you're doing water treatment. But when you're working on the business, you're thinking about why you do water treatment. And so if you can get out of the office for a few days and go talk to a bunch of people who are in the same situation as you, that's always going to be a healthy thing to do.
And that's coming up February 10th through 11th on 2020. That's going to be in Clearwater, Florida, I believe.
Right.
Well, Tom, I know I could probably ask you 1,000 other questions, but I know you have some other things that you have planned today. So I'm going to go straight to the lightning round if you're ready for that.
Sure.
All right. So now if you can go back in time and visit yourself on your very first day as a water treater, what advice would you give yourself?
Learn and be patient.
What are the last 3 books that you've read?
I have read Norwegian mythology.
Interesting.
I have read a book on prayer, a couple books related to estate planning.
I'm curious, what's one of your favorite water treatment reference books?
Well, for me, old school would be the Bet's Handbook.
Is that still in print?
I don't know, but I used it all the time. The other thing that might not still be in print that I use all the time, I don't know if you would remember this, called the Permuted Handbook.
I've never heard of that.
Permuted was, I believe, a resin manufacturer back in the day, but they had just a super helpful handbook with a bunch of tables and conversion factors and a lot of ion exchange and resin technology information. So for me, the resources were in the dark ages, the Bet's Handbook and the Permuted Handbook.
I interviewed Jay Farmery not too terribly long ago, and he turned me on to a book, and I don't remember the title, but the author was Leo Pincus. Does that ring any bells?
It does, yeah. I can't think of the title either.
That book is fantastic.
Yeah.
It's not in print anymore, and I found it used, but I did find it, and it is a very helpful resource. Eventually, Hollywood is going to learn about your life story. When they do, who plays you?
Let's see. I should have an answer to that. I'm getting older. If he wasn't already older than me, I would want Sean Connery to play me.
There you go. So more of a James Bond type approach to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think Sean Connery is still very, very cool.
And then my final question, if you could talk to anybody throughout history, who would it be with and why?
It'd be Jesus, because he's the most important figure in history. And I'd have a whole lot of questions for him.
Well, Tom, I had a whole bunch of questions for you, and I have a whole bunch more. So I really want to thank you for coming on Scaling Up H2O. And it is not out of the realm of possibility that I invite you back.
Be my pleasure. Trace, enjoyed it.
Well, Tom, I thought you did a great job at the Association of Water Technologies convention. You brought all of that and more to the Scaling Up Nation, and thank you for that. So, I got to tell you, every time I think about generations, I get confused. I interviewed a gentleman last year. His name was Jeff Butler, and what he does is he tries to educate people on generations. I think he had some of the most simplistic and easy to understand definitions that I've heard. So if you want to check out episode 104, if you haven't already, that might be a great complement to what you just heard. Now, the thing I really learned from Tom's data is that, he talked to so many water treatment company owners and sons and fathers, and all that was based on was really preparing for the next step. What is the next step? And I think about that all the time on this show. Heck, in a couple moments, I'm going to plead to you to give me some ideas so I can fill in that next step. But I can't help but think there's some water treaters out there listening. There's some individuals out there listening, and they're thinking, I don't own my own company. So did I just waste the last few minutes listening to this episode? And I don't think you did. I think you learned a lot more. You just might not know where to apply it. Think about it. Everything we do, there's always a next step. So are we actively thinking about what the next step is? Or are we just simply doing what we do day in and day out, and we're letting the next step happen by default? Folks, if we are not proactively thinking about the next step, we might not like what naturally occurs. So I think we can all take a moment and just think about, where are we going, and is that destination where we want to end up? And it might just take a little change. It might just take a small tweak to a habit that we have. What are we doing? How is it affecting us? And where are we going to end up? If we don't like that, we need to change something. And the good news is, we just realized it, we can affect it, and we can take the destination to wherever we want to go. Well, I told you it was coming. I am looking for more show ideas. People ask me here in Seattle, Washington, where do I get ideas from the show? And anything that interests me, I think, is good fodder for the show. I've got some good ideas from people that came up to me here in Seattle, Washington. You all know that I try to read a lot, so I can share that information with you on Scaling Up H2O. And the truth is, I do read books, and I do that. I know how to read, but I don't have time to read. What I do have time for is to take advantage of being in the car. So I turn windshield time into learning time. And when I'm not listening to a podcast, I am listening to Audible. There are so many book titles on Audible, and now I am able to listen to them when I have time to do so. Now, if you haven't tried Audible, I really think you will enjoy the service, and I can get you a free book and a free month by going to scalinguph2o.com/audible. Let me know what you think. And folks, you can even change the speed in which you listen to the books. So there's all sorts of tools on Audible. You can make notes on Audible. You can mark it as you're driving, even in a safe way, so you don't have to worry about taking your attention off the road. They've got a car app that helps you with that. Folks, Audible is a great service, and I know if you're not using it, you can use it to start reading again. And as I said, it is one of the ways that I get information for the topics on this podcast, but the number one way I get information for this podcast is from you. So if you have not done so, heck, even if you've done so, do it again. Go to scalinguph2o.com and send me a request for a show note. Just go to the show notes portion on the menu, fill that in, I will get it. We'll get that on the air, or better yet, you can click on the send a voicemail button. I will get a recording of your voice asking your question. I will play that on the air, and then we will answer that very question. So nation, please help me help you make this show into your own private learning studio. And I just got to say, thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you next week on Scaling Up H2O. Nation, there's no doubt about it. It is lonely out there, but it doesn't have to be. There are groups that exist to help us help each other get to where we need to go faster than we can on our own. One of those groups is the Rising Tide Mastermind. The Rising Tide Mastermind is a group where we come together each and every week to make sure we're holding each other accountable to make it to the next level. We also read books together, we attend a live event together, and members enjoy quarterly one-to-ones with me. To find out if the Rising Tide Mastermind is right for you, go to scalinguph2o.com/mastermind to learn more.